My name is Emma Arnold, and I'm a senior print journalism major here at Ole Miss, and I'm specializing in public relations and magazine publishing. And I plan to go to law school in the fall, so I'm waiting back to hear from law schools, but if that doesn't work out, then I would like to work in design with magazines. And so it is my honor to introduce Mr. Todd Krizelman, CEO of MEDIARadar. So please welcome him with me.
All right, it's great to see a whole bunch of familiar faces and also some new folks in the audience. So my name's Todd Krizelman. I'm going to take you through really a review of where print advertising stands in the United States. So my company, MEDIARadar, is most known for servicing ad sales teams. We work with about 1,600 ad sales teams, and that ranges from print magazines, but also Facebook and Google and NBC. We're very format agnostic. I got my start, however, definitely on the print side. I grew up in Palo Alto, California. I live in New York now with my wife, 2 daughters, a fish, and a dog, which is a lot. I worked at a printing press in high school, which is definitely how I ended up in the industry. I worked there for 5 years. I started in 8th grade, and I was lucky enough to be just about 2 houses down from the founder of Aldus PageMaker, which was sort of for those in the audience, sort of the predecessor to what is now Adobe InDesign, just laying things out. And when I worked there literally in the 5 years where we had a group of people laying out all the type and then about 3 years into that, they fired about 25 full-time people at the press. And that left a really deep mark on me about how ephemeral employment can be and how ephemeral industry could be. I didn't understand that our industry was just at the beginning of what will now feel like decades of perpetual change. After that, I went to college. I worked for a daily newspaper. They said, you worked at a press, so I read production. And I never got a chance to write really ever because I always ended up on the business side. Later, I got into the dot-com business in the first wave of dot-coms in the 90s. I took that company public. I sold subscriptions. That is actually, I sold some advertising, but it was mostly selling $100 annual subscriptions to chat, which looks fantastic. You know, it's hard to believe that was a possible business model because all of that is free. Acknowledging that I did not really know that much, I then went back and worked for Gruner & Jahr for 6 years, of really where I felt like I really learned the business of publishing. So often, one of the things that drives me personally, and some of you know this, is I hate when we read in the press about how the print industry is down. Because it is such a misinformed thing. Basically, anytime a magazine ceases, it gets a lot of attention. The 200 launches a year are a footnote, right? There's much more attention to when there is trouble. I do not think this is right at all. The other thing is the popular press, when we read something in the Wall Street Journal or even Adweek or Ad Age, which are wonderful periodicals, they will assume all media is the same if it started in print. But what we've come to understand, at least in our company, is we think about these businesses as each going through their own experience right now. There's national consumer media, which Dan was representing at HGTV. There is B2B, which in itself is hundreds, if not thousands, of separate verticals, each with their own ecosystem of advertisers, regional, science media, and enthusiast. We're not going to cover it all, but I am going to cover a lot of it, and in the case of a couple of these, we're going to do a deep dive, especially around enthusiasts and regional, where we see much more strength, actually, in particular in print. This presentation is going to be very print-centric. So even though we could talk about a lot of other elements, this is the one room annually. I probably attend 25 events. Just like John French, I feel like I am constantly looking to sort of improve my own game and listen. I see Bo often at these, and certainly you, Samir. It is about trying to understand how each of these is its own business. If we look at the number of pages purchased in the last year, we're talking about 470, almost 500,000 pages just on the consumer side. But over the last 4 years, if we were just to look broadly, we see a decline of 15%. And this is the problem. If we look at this alone, we might say, oh my goodness, this is awful, and it is bad, but it doesn't tell the real story. I often think of my high school math teacher who used to tell me, if your head's in the oven and your feet are in the freezer, how do you feel? And you say, on average, I feel fine. That is a little bit of the issue in our industry, right? Basically, if you had a huge decline of 40% in a year, everyone would wake up, but a lot of times the per year decline is mild. That's why I showed the 4-year decline to sort of get a bigger number. Where things are most troubled is in national consumer media. And I decided not to put the specific decline. This is a 10-year review in pages only, so this is not revenue. But if you were a student of SEC filings, you could, in the case of Meredith, go back and you could actually look at how the price is declining over time on the print side of the business. It's very meaningful, right? If you are in the consumer business, even though all these magazines have very different audiences and very different editorial focus, one thing in common is that they win most of their business, not all, but a lot of it comes from the agency side at the national market, which is either in New York, Chicago, LA, and some parts of Texas. And there we see the biggest print decline. And by the way, this present, we're just going to start at the bottom. The worst part of the story is at the front. And then it's going to, just so you know how this is going to unfurl. What's driving this? Look, it's all sorts of things. And you know it in your personal life. It is a huge number of new brands for whatever you think of them. They are simply competing for the same group of dollars. My observation, as it is for many of you, is that it's not that there's any decline in ad spend to support editorial and media today in the United States. There is more money available to you if you were sitting in this room than ever before. These are the good days. The horrible part is that anyone can compete for those dollars, right? LinkedIn can be in the B2B market aggressively, so can Facebook, right? So there are people who we don't even think about who are highly competitive in markets that simply weren't there. Dan said, Dan, are you in the room? Dan, you nailed it. TV, almost every major television broadcaster had to lay off hundreds of people last year. And that was because in their case, they're not just dealing with a change in buying patterns with advertisers. They have an even more unsettling issue where people are not watching television. And John talked about his neighbor with the fence. I have 2 young daughters. The older one is 6. She does not even understand the concept of what a TV versus an iPad. She doesn't understand those things. That she doesn't understand the construct that we had. And that is deeply unsettling. And I think about some of our customers in TV. I had one customer who said, we didn't even think about YouTube as a genuine competitor until last year. And I had to tell this executive, and this is an executive who's paid very well, and they're very bright. I said, YouTube by itself, not with Google, is bigger than all of NBC, Universal, like all the 22 cable channels plus NBC. And so it's estimated around 14 billion. That number is not even a disclosable number to Google. So if you look at the SEC filings for Google, they're so big they don't even have to break it out. I know, astonishing. And so as a result of that, that is what's creating all of this friction and all of this downward pressure. And I think what I would share for these big firms, they have responded appropriately. Basically, they have looked and become extremely creative in terms of reinventing and innovating. But still, the print drives a big piece of the revenue, and the print is definitely often a thought piece and this tactile experience and this reminder that comes to your door every 30 days. So now let's start getting into this. So one is, John French, are you in the office? Or in the office? Great. You said, go towards the light. Man, that is the most important thing of advice that can be offered. We observe that many companies don't. So if you go to the market, yes, the market is down in a lot of places, but it's not down evenly. Certain areas of the market are down, some are down a lot, and some are up. So in the national market, for example, the pharma market is down very lightly. One of the reasons that is, in terms of print paging, one of the reasons is that pharma companies have very strict regulatory rules that govern their marketing, and so they cannot easily buy on digital environments. So very, very big changes based on the category that you're in, based on the product category. And what we see, the people who are making the most money in today's market at the national level, for example, are steering their businesses towards the light. They'll say, oh, this area is really good. So for example, Eric Hoffman, are you in here? So when Eric was talking about last night, he said, he talked about regional, local business. He talked about CPG last night, driving business, tourism. This is right. Basically, we see in food, for example, even though there is a lot of editorial competition in this market, it is very healthy, right? There are new brands buying in print, 594 of them last year. There were another 256 existing brands that increased their print spend in national print magazines. And that is despite Epicurious and All Recipes and Food 52, tastingtable.com, a long list of really swell sites. So going towards the light, John, I'm just taking your idea. These are just a few examples, and obviously the two are from the Hoffman family and All Recipes, which is a Meredith title, that have had very strong success over just the last couple years. In B2B. B2B, I hesitate to tell a story like this with the down 3% in terms of advertisers, only because each B2B vertical is so unique. So for example, during the housing crisis, real estate is tanking. If you were a construction magazine, if anyone in the audience had worked at Hanley Wood during the trough of the recession, not a wonderful time to be in a construction magazine. Just tough. Independent of how well you run your business or any other variable, it's just very difficult. This is just looking at paging over time, much more stable, much more stable. And one of the things, if we had more time, we would show you all of the different verticals within B2B. Many are doing just fine. In fact, in B2B, there are many success points where some folks have certainly expanded into white papers and publishing webinars and live events. Live events is obviously a huge piece of the B2B model. But the core print piece, despite having some stress, is nowhere near, this is why I chose this to come next, is the level of stress. When you think about the fact that digital has been happening now for 20 years, right? Google just celebrated their 20 or 25th year. This is holding up, right, relative to what we see in other categories. I would tell you that two of the pressures on B2B companies are not where you think, and this is something we talk about with clients. On the left is just who do you compete with? A lot of times when you think about your market in B2B, if you're Hanley Wood and you're in construction, you think, I compete against other people who produce editorial around construction or home building. But today, LinkedIn has what feels like an actual army of humans who are trying to sell advertising into the B2B market. In fact, I went to one of the ABM Now Connective meetings a couple years ago. It was in Chicago. And actually, I was really both impressed and shocked. LinkedIn sent a person to stand on stage to that audience and say, "We're coming for you." I was like, wow, I guess we'll start tracking that. And they've been very successful, right? So it's not, a lot of times in business, we do a share of market report. We say, here are the 6 books I really compete against in my market. Now you have to almost always add LinkedIn, and these other companies, and this is just a sample of a dozen of them, Demandbase, Infer, Madison Logic, all are after the same dollar that a B2B publisher usually gets. On the right is just an interesting observation, which is largely tablets have not met the expectation in the consumer market from when they were first released 6 or 7 years ago. But there are examples where mobile and tablet editions work very well in B2B. Farm Journal is a client of ours, and they talk all the time about farmers are on the farm, they're in the field, they're in a combine, mobile devices fit very well for them. And even more so, for sure, they would say this idea that certain populations are not tech savvy is gone. Basically, everyone is tech savvy. There are almost no people who do not have smartphones anymore. The adoption rate has been breathtaking, right? It's just been in a 5-year window. I'm just doing a quick time check. All right. So, regional marketing. We track regional marketing in depth in about 22 DMAs. And there are about 250,000 ad pages last year that were placed in that. Again, each state can be pretty different. Each city can be certainly different. And so I wanted to show you a deep dive just on the Texas market because it's one of the largest states, one of the largest economies, and it's a good bellwether in some ways for how regional publishing is working. So more than anything else, do the macroeconomics matter in regional publishing? And we find that they really do. Whether it's the wealth of a certain zip code that you're publishing in, whether it's the size of the economy, the growth rate, the Forbes ranks almost every city in America by how friendly they are to businesses. So basically we plotted basically states and cities that are more business friendly tend to sell more advertising. And they're better, basically if you were going to expand your regional business into a new city, these are some of the other variables you would look at. So in Texas, this is just a review of 4 cities, Austin, Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio. We track about 80 print publications in those 4 cities, and they bought last year 37,000 pages of advertising. So let's talk about the winners. So where some markets we see that there are mostly people who are either flat or slightly down, Texas is a great example that if you are a good business operator, you can make a lot of money. These are just some of the examples of people who are up over 15% last year. 40% of regional-focused books in Texas had great years in 2016. Meanwhile, 60% didn't. So if you happen to bump into someone, or if you were interviewing people in Texas to understand the market, you'd have to make sure you actually either study the market or interview enough people before you would come to the right conclusion. If you are one of the people down in the state of Texas, there can be a lot of, obviously, individual reasons, but in general, we would say, look, it may be that there is something about your sales team or your editorial or something intrinsic to you rather than intrinsic to the market that is driving the difficulty, right? If your whole market's down, we can say, okay, that is a difficult market. Everyone's down, no matter how good they are. But when almost half the market is doing fine, then you have to look more inwardly and say, okay, how do I improve my business to do better in this competitive environment? I also thought this was encouraging just based on the type of magazines. They were all, at first I saw Modern Luxury Brides and I thought, oh, maybe luxury magazines, that's the trick. But then we saw Houston Women or Dallas Magazine or Fort Worth Business Press. There was no common theme that would have said, oh, that's why they failed or that's why they succeeded. Again, though, I do think you have to think about the macroeconomics of what's happening in the market and think about how do you get to the light. So yesterday, Susan, are you in the audience? All right. So last night you brought up Amazon Prime. How many are Prime members? Almost everyone in this room. I'm like a better parent because they can deliver things that fast. So when we look at the largest category of advertising in the state of Texas, it's retailers. So what do you think happened to retail advertising in 2016 last year? Did it go up or down? Went down. It's going down because retail is going down everywhere. This is a year-over-year review of, it's hard to a little bit, I'm sorry, it's like an eye test here. So basically in 10 years, Best Buy's stock is in half. JCPenney, which is in Texas, their stock is down 83%. Kohl's down 59%. Macy's closing stores just announced, almost 50%. Nordstrom, considered one of the best operators in the country, down 21%. Sears down 95%. Not a pretty story. I didn't put together that chart. That was taken from Yahoo Finance. Amazon, though, is up 1,900% in that same period. And so this is going to impact publishing regionally for sure. And there's a lot of discussion, by the way, in a lot of towns when you think about how is a city supposed to respond. A lot of real estate firms, for example, in where I live in Manhattan, they're basically saying where it used to be 50% of retail, 50% of storefronts would be for retail, and the other 50% were for everything else, bars, restaurants, that it's going to change quite dramatically. Like, they're not just hoping it's going to change. The major real estate companies are going to force the change. They're going to put in many more restaurants because they think they will be better tenants. Many more Duane Reads or Walgreens, pharmacies, things that people need, wine shops, things that people want within arm's reach. Okay, that sounded bad, but you get the basically urgent care centers, basically a group of retailers who will make good advertisers, but they're not all there yet. And so if you were selecting a new place to launch an additional city to publish in, you would want to look where the ratio of retail to restaurants and bars and these other things was more favorable for you. Because retail is being hurt, and we do see them downsizing. And so in Texas, even though we had many success stories, the retail advertising, which is the biggest piece, dropped 25% in a single year. And you guys answered the question more or less for yourselves. I was even surprised how many of you raised your hands about Amazon Prime. Do you know that, and this is not I'm an Amazon shareholder, so I listen to their calls. The average person will spend 5 times more on Amazon after they become a Prime member. Right? That's why, even though they basically don't make any money on that $100 or $120, that's why they do it, because they basically see you will turn into a spending machine. So, are ads for restaurants and bars going up in Texas? You bet. So it's so fascinating to me, right? So we can learn a lot from just looking at these bigger trends. If we know retail is getting killed across the country by Amazon specifically, when we're thinking about how do we build a business, you don't have to avoid it completely, but really focus on the other elements that are actually that are continuing to spend. Real estate's another category that is up in Texas. There were 1,100 new real estate developments that specifically bought print advertising. There were another existing 415 that increased their investment year over year. So we started with Texas, and actually, to be truthful, when I started this analysis, I chose like 5 states, and I thought maybe I would stand up here and I would say how each state has a totally different story. But actually, I didn't find that. I really found that the story was very similar. Without giving us too much math here, the point of the story is that I compared, in this case, Texas to California, and they are almost identical in terms of the percentage of each category that drives business, right? So retail is 32% of Texas, it's 34% of California. Travel and leisure is 6% of California, it's 7% of Texas. It's as if I had made it up, but I didn't. It was actually the opposite of the story I had originally imagined telling. All right. So what is the point of knowing that California and Texas and other states are very similar? Is that you can do benchmarking. Right? You don't need to look at your competitive set at all. You can just say, how do I look against other regional magazines that are in print in other parts of the country and see, does their composition of advertisers, is it similar to me? And if it's not, what can I learn from studying them to become as good as the benchmark? By the way, this is totally encouraging in Texas. And every company, I would tell you, every publisher should do this, is really study the number of new advertisers in the market each year. There are many more than you think. Almost everyone in publishing says a sentence at some point. They say, I've been doing this for 20 years. I'm 43. I've been doing this for 20 years. Don't you think I wouldn't know what's in my backyard? I've heard a flavor of that, either out of my own mouth or out of our customers' mouth. It just was something we say because we believe we're knowledgeable. But there is much more new business out there to be had than people realize. In the case of Texas alone, it was 7,000 new advertisers who'd never purchased before each year. So just some quick, we have about 5 minutes left. As we think about enthusiasts, Brian, you and I were talking about this right before I got on stage. Michaela, who was formerly, just recently stepped down as president of Dwell, she came and she said, hey, she just said, quick litmus test, is the market, how's the market doing? She's like, I want to compare the market to me. These are all examples of like how you view your world, right? There are 56 national shelter magazines, so books about home and decor and shelter. Half of, literally just about half are up and half are down. Right, so we can't say, you know, it's so simple like the whole market is up or the whole market is down. It is a mix perhaps of your piece of the shelter market plus how are you going to market, what is your go-to-market strategy in terms of your sales team. How many of you know Monocle magazine? All right, that's a really high number. All right, good. So this is one of my favorite launch titles. It launched about just 10 years ago. And for anyone who's a student, this is a really good one. This is sort of as we wrap up. This is a great one to think about because it was a startup. They do about $25 million a year. And it is, to me, if you think about all the things that you learn in school and we've learned professionally over all our years, to me it is a great modern publishing house. And there are other examples that are great, and I often think of Active Interest Media, but those businesses are big businesses. This is a nice sort of small to mid-sized business where the print physical product looks incredible. Absolutely dynamite. It is expensive to produce. It is expensive to buy. It's $12 to $15 an issue. An annual subscription is never discounted. But when you get this thing, and this made me think of that tactile discussion at the beginning of the day, you do have a sort of a desire to collect them. It is phenomenal. If you've never bought this, it's a mix between, and this is an unusual pairing of editorial content, it's like The Economist meets a high design magazine. It's a very, like if someone had written this out on a business plan to me, I would have said this would have been like, I would have asked who's the client and this is a mess. But it is really very brilliantly executed. And with that, to give you an idea of this idea of collection from that very first story this morning, they will, because they learn that people like the tactile experience so much, they will sell you wrappers that they charge extra for to store them correctly, which I think is it was genius. That's all profit, by the way, right? But it's genius. You're basically encouraging people to save the asset that they have purchased. Right? It creates that sense of value. They have created a small publishing arm to create books for their readers. They have a small physical imprint of 7 or 8 stores in sort of large cosmopolitan areas. They have one in New York. That's a photo of it. I went out and got one. They do podcasts. They do events. This is their quality of life event that they held in Berlin last year. To me, this is an example of, and on an advertising perspective, which is how I can measure it, and by the way, they have just national luxury advertising. Over most of these years, they have had growth in each year. And I looked at just Q1, like just the first few months of this year, they were up 56%. So I view print as something with a lot of eager hope. I think we really do, Jerry and I were just talking about, often print is put in this box, right? That it is somehow older or cannot be done well or it is not as fresh and innovative. But I really reject that idea because there are many examples, of which this is just one of my personal favorites, of where you can see that if the product is manufactured really well, that in turn creates better user engagement, and that in turn drives advertisers to want to be associated with the magazine. So just key takeaways. I think there is a lack of information in general around the print piece. We're so busy talking about how we're going to get into digital. that the print metrics are really important to study because they can show you the way, just as we were talking about with retail, to understand what really threatens your business. Is it a souring economy? Is it a new competitor? Is it a change in your advertiser community, as we've seen in the national advertising business? To identify where is the light for opportunities to increase sales. I think about this all the time. I've been doing MEDIARadar for 12 years. I make mistakes all the time. Not all management is created equally at all. Be the very best practitioner of print publishing, right? There are 120 digital events per year. This is one of the only ones. The 125 that are for digital, there's only a handful that are print-centric at all. And so for sure, this is a really important thing to focus on, is how do you get better at the print stuff. And finally, study what others are doing. Innovate, but don't be afraid of copying. Right? There's a lot of cynicism around saying, oh, that worked for them, I don't want to try that. Or people don't say it quite like that. But basically, there are a handful of people making great money in print right now. Watch what they're doing and replicate it, or innovate on it, build on it. Thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate it.